America? What is it that America wanted to achieve with photography? Photography, since it had been relegated to the realm of the sciences, and because the most beautiful images were made with the touch of a button. Let me see if I can mute everyone, and then we can hear better. Okay, so everybody can hear me? The daguerreotype, we said before, a couple of weeks ago, the daguerreotype made such beautiful images, but there was only one. There was no negative. There was just one image. And because there were just one image, and because of the process itself, they couldn't replicate the image. What is going to be a very important invention is the negative. Because if there are many steps to create the final image, the artist hand can intervene in the process, and consequently, it can be made artful. It can be made artistic. And in that sense, you can create an opportunity for it to be an art form that doesn't have to be a handmaiden to the other arts, but can have its own prestige and make its own contribution. Now, in the United States, everything that we brought from the European world, whether it was architecture, literature, or any of the arts, it was considered to be having roots in classicism, in the traditional way of doing things. So some of you have been together with me for so many lectures that you're aware of the term secession. There was a moment right around the end of the 1890s when so many people participating in different art forms wanted to secede from the classical traditional stance on every aspect of the arts. They wanted it to change because the world was changing. And because the arts are always a reflection of the world and its period in which people are making their art, they wanted it to be a reflection of an automated, industrialized world. And consequently, the camera was the perfect answer. It was a machine that could make documents of the machine age. That was realistic. A painting can be made up, but a photograph in general is considered to be the real thing. Even though in a few minutes you'll see that because artists and photographers and people working generally in those mediums are such creative people, that they think 10 different ways of doing something that no one has thought of before. Creative people don't follow the rules, they make the rules, and consequently they elevate the art form when they're successful. So one of the things that is the most touching to me from the lecture that we talked about 2 weeks ago is that mankind tends to be, we're just hardwired. We're hardwired to be innovative. We're hardwired to be creative. We're hardwired to think out of the box. And we always want to make things better than they were before. So all these things coming together created a brand new art form that could be appreciated in a way that permitted those artists that in many cases couldn't make a living in the art world because there was so much competition, and they were able to parlay their understanding of proportion, their understanding of composition, and all those things, and they were able to make art with a machine and make it compelling enough to be respected as something that could live in its own right because it was making a great contribution to society. So nod your head and tell me, can you see this lovely picture of all these people that are going to be the prominent citizens we're going to discuss today, among many others? This is the work that was done by Alfred Stieglitz when he was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. This is the work that was done by Edward Steichen, who a lot of people don't know very well, but they really should, because he was one of the greatest photographers of the 20th century that worked in so much different kinds of media that it boggles the mind. And Gertrude Kasebier, who was promoted by Stieglitz, which was a huge gift for women, because it was a way to say to some women that you too can participate in this art form and even make a decent living at it. So we do have quite a number of people that were not here with us 2 weeks ago. Therefore, what I'd like to do is just show you what we discussed. We talked about one of the first people that was interested in the chemical process of sensitivity to light, chemicals that were sensitive to light, because photography means writing with light. His name was Nicephore Niepce, and he made one of the first pictures of his backyard here after numerous attempts to try to get the image to fix itself so that it would not just dissipate and evaporate into thin air. He used all kinds of mediums, all kinds of chemical processes, and all kinds of metals to try to make this come to pass. Eventually, he did succeed. As you can see, it didn't make a really strong image, but he did manage to succeed after exposing his camera obscura, his little black box that had a hole in it, facing the sun for 8 hours. Now, he got together with another man who was a genius in his own right. His name was Louis Daguerre. He was a painter, and he was a man that participated in the arts and did many things. He developed a camera in which he began to use lenses in it so that he could focus on the subject that he was interested in making an image of and make it as perfect and as sharp as possible. So what Louis Daguerre managed to do is to take a picture, the first picture of a person. And this is what is happening here. At this point, he didn't have to point his camera for 8 hours toward the image he wanted to make, but it did take a full 5 minutes. Now, this was a busy street in Paris in which lots of carriages were going up and down the streets and people were walking up and down the sidewalks. But this man was having his shoes shine. And because he was standing still for at least 5 minutes. And consequently, we have this first image. What Louis Daguerre did with the invention of his camera is that he managed to finesse his work to the extent that he was producing these unbelievably beautiful, crisp images that were simply called mirrors of memory. They were so accurate that they looked like an actual mirror that had memory embedded in it. And because there was this big explosion and interest around photography, because people didn't live a long time, because there was a high infant mortality rates, that this would be the one image that people would hold near and dear to themselves and forever have a memento of someone that had passed. It was the first time in history that you could see your grandparents, even if they had predeceased you by decades. So what happened with around this interest was, as I said, everyone is always trying to make these ideas better and to make these ideas stand out that are unique unto themselves. So Antoine Claudet was a French daguerreotype photographer who began to add these kind of lovely additions to the background, whether they were painted sometimes or they were, the room was dressed in this way and designed in this way to make the picture come together in a homey kind of way, in an elegant kind of way. And also he managed to use watercolors to colorize the daguerreotype. But as we said, the most essential thing, if you're going to make something an art form, is the ability to manipulate the process. Consequently, Henry Fox Talbot is in many ways considered to be the grandfather of this whole undertaking. Because he invented the negative, his first portraits looked very soft and kind of gentle because he wasn't able to replicate them as in the same way that the daguerreotype was made, but we have this added advantage of having the negative. And sometimes when you have the negative and the positive right on top of each other, then you are able to make a more crisp look. So the ambrotype by another British photographer and sculptor was taking the softer look of Talbot and making it sharper and crisper. So on this continuum of innovations that keep taking place so that more people can have photographs of loved ones, we even have the tintype, the most inexpensive, direct, positive kind of representation, which was printed on metal. I guess we could say it was printed on metal in that way. So photographers started to work all over the United States making these kind of tintypes, and there were millions. I think that many people say upwards of 12 to 13 million tintypes made in the United States during the Civil War period, because parents, sisters, brothers, fathers wanted a remembrance of a son that may not come back. But another man that made so many contributions to these innovative times was a man called Blancard Everard. He was French. He was a photographer and a photo publisher and an inventor. He worked in so many different mediums. He developed a way of washing the negative into the positive in a chemical bath, that you didn't necessarily have to make a certain kind of photograph. It could be a calotype, an ambrotype, a tintype, and you could still wash it in these chemicals and they would show up, and you have a variety of ways to produce the image. So photographers for 4 decades, between 1850 and 1890, used the print that was developed by this man, and that print was known as the ambrotype print. Excuse me, the albumen print. Now, what we can see that happens that is quite interesting is the camera around the 1860s and 1870s read the sky-colored blue and white clouds as the same color, and consequently, you rarely see clouds. You will when they start to make combination prints, but generally speaking, when they took this kind of a photograph, you almost never saw clouds if you were using the process that was invented by that French photographer. And in addition to that, we know that photography became a very important way to document events. In particular, photography in America, people were absolutely obsessed because people were moving westward. The whole country was being covered by immigrants moving from east to west, and they couldn't believe some of the kind of the magical landscapes that were part of the West that no one had ever seen anywhere else in the world. As you know, this is something that Georgia O'Keeffe is going to paint as a regional painter. They saw colors out west, quite frankly, that people described as ridiculous because they'd never seen such a kaleidoscope of colors. What happens here then is we start to see that the way that the water is captured and the various textures that we see everywhere not only make these kind of photographs so interesting, but they document places people would never have been able to go and see typically for themselves. So now we come up, this becomes a very big part of documenting and sharing experiences So much so that many people that traveled the world, if they didn't take an image of what they had seen, they could almost say, I don't think I even went there. So it became kind of a way to confirm that you had been. Now, one of the reasons that it's so important for clouds to be part of the story, in actual fact, is because clouds, for many generations, for many hundreds of years, have been used as a metaphor for an artist's expression. And more often than not, clouds were used to express the artist's emotional state. So again, it's kind of something that artists that are photographers are going to aspire to. They want to capture the clouds, and we will see toward the end of this lecture that Alfred Stieglitz is going to make that one of his missions. Now, photographers that are professional are going to produce magnificent things because they are all, by the way, chemists. There is no place that you can send your negatives to be printed at this time. Artists are chemists. They're chemists, they're artists, and they're photographers. But what begins to encroach on this arena is when you start to get people that make photography for the love. That's, I think, the root word for amateur is a love for something, a love for this medium. Say in the case of Julia Margaret Cameron, who was among the many wealthy women at this time that were upper class women. Well, I should restate that. Those women that were involved in photography at this time, many or almost all of them would have been from wealthy families, because the chemical processes, whether it was silver or platinum or any of these kind of metals that you had to use to make these images, have always been expensive, and they had to have their own dark room, they had to have their own equipment. So we're talking about high-class people that have access to dressing up women in this way, and also being intertwined with major events that are taking place in history. In the 1800s, this is when we have Lord Elgin bringing the Parthenon marbles to England. And this was such a newsworthy event that you can see she's having these women dress in this classical historical style from the ancient world. The art world became very nervous as a result of the fact that such good quality photographs could be made, that the one thing that the art world had in its favor was that they could paint in color. And at this time, colorizing daguerreotypes was okay, but of course it wasn't the real thing. It was manipulated. So now what you have is you have the artisans that stand out from the photographers who are encroaching on their livelihood. They are able to choose any color that is available for them to get and make these kind of very beautiful paintings, and they can also make them very large. At this moment, photography is made on a small scale, and I'll show you in a few moments how tiny it actually was. Well, what we have is we have the detractors, like, say, Charles Baudelaire, who is a good friend of the French Impressionists. He wants to denigrate photography. He says that photography should be a servant, like the sciences were servants and served in a humble way, and that they should not in any way be considered high art. In the photography world, we saw that because you had to look away from the camera, because the aperture had to stay open such a long time, generally speaking, the subjects that were being photographed looked away or held their eyes in such a way that their eyes could be relaxed, so that they would be inclined to hold their eyes still and not blink. If they blinked, they created a ghostly image on the picture. So what happens is the artist of this period, this happens to be Edouard Manet and his sister-in-law Berthe Morisot, he is in many ways mimicking the fact that the subjects are not looking necessarily directly at the person that is painting them. And what we see is lots of paintings that look like a candid camera shot. They're also cropped in the same way that you would crop a photograph. When Gustav Caillebotte was making this picture of his brother standing at the window here in this prestigious area that they lived in, he is painting himself in sepia tones, and he is also making this candid camera shot in which the subject is not even aware that he is being painted, so to speak, like a photographer would be making an image of him. And we see oftentimes these kind of representations of cropped paintings because of the cropping that was done around the photographs. The sepia tones bring about the sepia colors in the art world, when we know darn well that somebody like Degas certainly did not have to rely on sepia tones, as he's considered to be one of the greatest colorists of all time. So what happens here is this: there is a big fight going on for photography to find its way into the art world and for photographers to somehow protect their livelihood. Now, one of the ways that many artists like Eugène Boudin or Claude Monet, even, one of the ways that they made extra money was taking themselves to the seaside on a Sunday afternoon, and they had these little palettes they could paint on that canvases, excuse me, these little canvases that were about the size of a postcard. They were about 4 by 6 inches across, and you could make someone a tiny little painting that they could take home with them as a memento. And this would be their remembrance of the day that they spent at the beach with friends and family. And this too was going to pass very quickly, because photographers were making their way to the seaside, to the parks, to the streets, to downtown centers, and consequently the fight was on, and it was bitter. It was bitter for artists whose bread and butter was diminishing quickly, because not only could they not earn extra bucks here and there, but their mainstay always was portraiture. So now what happens is the artists are continuously working on this momentum that they have set for themselves. One of the ways that they were going to attempt to make photography artful is that at a certain point, as you know, when we talked about the albumen print, it was fixed with egg whites. Consequently, if you fix an image with egg whites, it has a shine. And if it has a shine on it, it has that glossy shine, it may not be looked upon as high class, but something a little bit garish. So the albumen print began to kind of go out of fashion, and they started to use platinum prints that had less sepia tones in them and more kind of black and neutral tones in this way. And also they did not have that shiny component. They were matte, they were flat, they had a flat finish. And as we can see with this man, he is going to begin to use his brushes. Sometimes they used other ways to manipulate the negative, and started to create this kind of image that looked like it could be a drawing, it could be a partial photograph that was manipulated in many ways that made it look in this way more artistic. And in addition to that, when they brushed different chemicals on, as you can see here, there are some brush strokes here, which sometimes are matted out in museums. You don't see this part because they put the mat right there. What happens is you start to see that artists are not so much always washing their work in their little bowl of chemicals, or their box of chemicals, but they are brushing it on to get different kind of finishes. And the painting process then says that you are indeed painting. You are painting chemicals on chemically sensitive materials, papers, sometimes glass. So now what happens here then is we have another Frenchman who's interested in capturing the clouds, which he is unable to do in 1859. So what he does is he sort of weaves together two separate negatives. And he's done this on a very stormy day where there is a distinct difference between the shades and tones and color. And he weaves it together with this great wave that he makes at another time. So again, what we're seeing is, though he's using scientifically based ideas with chemicals, experiments, physics, et cetera, he is also in some ways creating a fiction. And at the same time, he is doing something that is unique, and therefore it's artistic in its own right. Whereas, say, in a case like this artist is replicating a history painting. He's actually, well, he's replicating a bacchanal, if you will. He's replicating this ecstatic expression of sexuality, sensuality, drinking for the god Dionysus or Bacchus. And we know that he would have been influenced by compositions of people that are even around his time. They are his contemporaries doing this kind of work, which, by the way, would typically have hung in a man's bedroom. So these kinds of things that are being done are done in this classical historical way, but we also know that they're done to kind of as an expression of sensuality, sexuality, and, you know, enjoying life on that level. Here is a man that we saw before, Henry Peach Robinson, to add these different negatives that he put together. There were 7 or 8 different negatives. If you are a photographer, you know that you cannot possibly light everyone in the same way evenly. That's not the way light works, but he does it to tell a story, so that he can tell you that as a photographer, he is doing what he can to promote this as an art form. His hands are involved in the process. Not only that, he was good enough at doing the kind of work in which he could do some drawing and intersperse it with these kind of pieces that he will also manipulate. Another well-heeled lady that was interested in doing these kinds of things was Georgina Filmer, who is known for using her photographs in this way, in which she is among the first to make this kind of multimedia photographic colored pencil collage. And say this man, whose work is so overly like scratched and brushed that you don't know if he is making something strictly with a pencil, or it's something that is done with a mechanical way, with lithography, with presses or what. But this is to what extent he's going to make this look something that is almost completely handmade. And there are, of course, always those people that are experts at colorizing photographs. So something like this made in 1880, this Japanese photographer, printer, and publisher was a pioneer in doing this kind of expert work. So what I would like to convey to you today is that one of the most clever ways that photographers attempted to get their foot in the door and to make a distinct place for photography as an art form was to follow art movements. They followed the art movements that were the most popular of their day, so that they could say that they're telling a similar story. They just happen to be using a different medium. And the man of the hour that is absolutely essential to discuss then today is Alfred Stieglitz. In the same way that we have had, let's say, 4 or 5 lectures on the Renaissance could not have been discussed without Florence and without the de' Medici family. You cannot discuss modern photography without Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was a lucky, lucky boy. In many ways, he came from one of the wealthiest families in America. His father just happened to get the contract to supply the Union Army with wool fabric during the Civil War. You can make a few bucks doing that. So the family became extraordinarily wealthy, and the family was highly cultured. They came from Germany, and they immigrated to the United States, eventually ending up in New York City. And the parents were very much promoters of all things artistic and cultural. What happens with Alfred Stieglitz is his father wanted his children to get a better education in the 1880s than they could get in the US. So he took his family, the father took his family, this is Alfred Stieglitz as a young boy, to Berlin, I believe it is, where he was supposed to study. Alfred Stieglitz was supposed to study chemical engineering. No doubt with textile businesses, it's good to have a chemical engineer in the family. What happens with Stieglitz is he did begin his studies with chemical engineering, and then he fell in love with photography on a weekend when he went off to make photographs with one of his professors. What will happen with Stieglitz is he's making his work in 1889, when we have now a huge respect, a huge burgeoning respect for the French Impressionists and even the Post-Impressionists. The Post-Impressionists begin around the 1890s. And we know the French Impressionists have now been working for about 20 years, and they are making genre paintings. They're making paintings of everyday life. What you can see that Stieglitz is doing is he is the man that is responsible for us referring to a picture or calling a photograph a picture and calling a painting a picture. He is responsible for that because he began, among other people, to refer to these genre paintings as pictorials. And pictorials not only show you everyday life, but they create a wonderful mood that you can lose yourself in. American Impressionists were doing the same things. They were making these paintings of everyday life. They too are using, you can see, kind of sepia tones, if you will, and they are creating this lovely kind of family tender scene. And as the camera becomes more able to focus and more able to make more clear images, what we see that happens is this kind of picture of lapping water, of kind of this kind of gentleness of nature, all of these things that are being shown to us here, and even perfecting the use of seeing the clouds there. They're still not as intense as they will be in years to come, but we can see that there are distinctions between textiles. There are distinctions between shapes of people. They're more clear, they're more natural looking, and they replicate the kind of ideas that are being expressed here. The impression. These artists are giving you the impression of what they feel when they stand here observing this very happy moment. And we here are also drawn in because our senses, we can almost feel the barometric pressure in the air here. Our senses, we have a mental memory of these things, and consequently, we are being sensitized to what we're looking at. Well, there was a big movement now. Before the French Impressionists began, there was a big movement that came to be known as realism. And realism had a lot to do with elevating the status of the common man. This is why at this time in history, you saw the kind of writings by the Bronte sisters and by Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy. We're talking about people that struggle, people that are trying to make their way through a brand new world where they're traveling in trains and where people are hungry in the countryside and all that. So this became known as this moment in which genre paintings, realistic paintings of life began to dominate this period. So artists are always going to look back to the art world to influence their work because the artists have already worked out the compositions. So it's a way that you can make a picture and crop it to make it look like that too, if you wish. But what happens to Stieglitz while he is still in Germany and able to take these jaunts around Europe, he goes to Italy, and I believe he even went to Austria to make these kind of genre paintings of simple, impoverished people's lives, doing these kind of little charming things, children around the well. In the United States, though, these genre paintings had a more profound impact on the artists in America, because in America, we were absorbing so many millions of immigrants that were coming to the United States, and so many immigrants that were coming to the United States, as most were extremely impoverished people. There was really no such thing in the United States as a systematic kind of welfare address for the people that needed so much help. So those people that were photographers and artists and writers were derided as being muckrakers by journalists because they were, dishing a lot of muck about what was happening in America. But in actual fact, they were very much supported by the government, by Roosevelt and others who wanted to create a progressive era in which artists participating in changing the lives of those that needed it the most. The American Ashcan painters said they had a moral and ethical responsibility to society, and that they were compelled to reveal the truth about life in order to make their world a better place. What these artisans did was pack a punch with their work. They made the kind of paintings that made you take stock of who you were as a person, frankly, because when you look at this kind of picture, you know that these men are not athletes. These men are laborers that probably work out of doors as stevedores or God knows what. They're living in the city. They're fighting an illegal boxing match so that they could earn a few extra dollars. There are no rules here. It doesn't matter which one of these men dies. They're so poor, their life is worth nothing. They are the kind of people that you can see their legs are white, their torso is dark. They are the laborers that might have a sick child at home, that might have a shortfall in rent and have to make a few extra dollars. And they are here in a cage like animals. So who do you put in a cage but animals? But the big question is, who are the animals? Is it not the people that are wearing three-piece suits with white collars and white starched shirts that are the animals that are watching this as entertainment? This was a critical moment in American history, as we are experiencing now. This is a critical moment when the questions have to be asked. What is it that we are supposed to do for people that don't have a voice? When we see this kind of work and we see that life is so difficult, so harsh, living in these kind of slums, and these young women, though they might have been innocent at some point, we can see that their innocence is drawing further and further away from them. Well, these kind of pictures are still something that someone could paint that may not be the truth. But photography at this point is the truth. Photography acts as this important impediment, a voice for people who cannot speak for themselves. Never mind, they don't even speak the same language. And they are people that are sometimes have orphan children living on the streets. The camera then was something that was promising as a way to change things. It became a very important part of this social justice era. It became a very, very big part of the kind of change that was going to take place. Now, here again, when we see the work of Childe Hassam, he's making a painting of kind of the brutal conditions. Maybe actually this might be the day that they're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. I don't know. Or maybe they can't cross the Brooklyn Bridge because before it was open to traffic, people crossed it. So the point is this, that you have this palpable feeling of what it is to shiver in the winter on this day. And though this conveys emotions and it creates a document, and it certainly shows you some of the complexity of the engineering of the Brooklyn Bridge, it does not hold a candle to this. The machine age was exploding, innovations, technology were everywhere. So now it was up to the artist to do what it is that he thought was right and proper. In the case of Alfred Stieglitz, he admired the Ashcan painters because they were trying to make positive change. And at the same time, he was enormously proud of the fact that he lived in New York City, and his work looked on the one hand, kind of brutally atmospheric, and at the same time, gently nationalistic, I think you could say. It was a city that was becoming the capital of finance, architecture, and culture. And so he wanted to document it as an authentic thing with photography. Of course, one of the most important ways that you get information to anyone is through print. Photography at this time in history, you could not replicate a picture of a picture in a magazine. Consequently, any magazines that were published, like Camera Notes or Camera Work or whatever it is that Alfred Stieglitz was going to do in this kind of 7-8 year period, was that you had to print the negative, make a positive, and glue it into the magazine. Consequently, the magazines were exorbitantly expensive. But those artists that were invested in elevating this art form were constantly interested in spreading their reputation and making it known in various photographic magazines that the aesthetics of photography had to be something that should be discussed, and it could be something that would be valuable and legitimated if enough people made high quality art. So we can see the big difference here. This is a painting that was made of the Saint Lazare railroad station by Monet, 1877. Now, we all know that the dark plumes that come out of an engine like this are dangerous to breathe. They are, it's noisy here. It's dangerous. You just get black, ugly clouds of smoke. But you see, he was trying to convey something that was much different than what you see in reality. And that was that he saw the French world becoming part of the industrialized landscape of Europe, because they were so far behind the British with railroad systems and everything else that the British were doing, that he shows you that the plumes here look like the clouds of heaven that are being intertwined with something that is greater than the average person. Whereas here you see a true document of what is it that the machine age looks like. And you can reference these moments as a time when America was being catapulted into a completely new reality. Now, by the time he was in his late 20s, his parents insisted that he come home from Europe, and that he make a life for himself, that he get married. And what does he do? He marries a young woman who's an heiress from a beer making family, and they live very beautifully. She has her own income. He has an income from his parents of what would be the equivalent today of $10,000 a month, which he's going to use for his endeavors. She is bourgeois to the core, and the two of them go on a honeymoon trip that is a disaster. Their whole marriage, their 20+ year marriage, is going to be a disaster. She is, bourgeois. He is, he's actually bourgeois too, but he likes to think of himself as the common man. He's interested in the common man. But for one thing for sure that he's interested in is this promotion of art, which she has no interest in. They, unfortunately, have a child who in later years is going to be diagnosed as schizophrenic. And because of this, when he even marries, say, Georgia O'Keeffe, he will never, ever have another child again, not only because of the trauma of the diagnosis that his daughter got, but that his oldest sister died in childbirth as well. Still, what we know is he lives with a lot of calamities that are taking place in his life. Until he meets Georgia O'Keeffe, things are difficult for him, his home life and so on. But one of the things that gives him a lot of solace is always working on his art. The marriage is unhappy. The union from the very beginning is a bad one, but the art is what gives him his lifeblood. And in the 1890s, they go on a honeymoon where instead of eating dinner at Maxim's, he's making photographs of the countryside in Holland. He's not at all interested in kind of acquiescing to his wife's visits to her couturier, etc. But here is what he has to overcome. This is a picture that we can say easily has the same quality of empathy, sympathy, care, consideration. It's something that draws you in the same way that Millet's Gleaners does. Gleaners shows you a picture of people who are practically starving in the countryside. They're picking up, they are the ones, the anonymous people that do all the back-breaking work. And the grain merchants that are wearing their three-piece black suits here, who have mountains of grain now because of the back-breaking labor they do, they control the price of grain. And these are the people that are picking up a few wisps of grass of wheat to make another loaf of bread, perhaps. So this is one of those social conscience, realistic paintings. And what you have here is also kind of a dreadful story. We can't see the clouds very well, but we know it's a foreboding sky. And the wind is so strong that it's kicking up this woman's skirt. And the mothers and the sisters and the daughters are looking in this direction to see where their men are. They've been caught off guard in a storm. And the contrast that is so brilliant here is the first thing that we always look at in a photograph, by the way, is where are the people? That's the first thing we connect with, the story of the people. If there are no people, we look for animals. If there are no animals, we look for something organic. We look to something that is more like us. Well, what we see here that is the composition, what makes it so rich, is that not only do we sense the worry of these women, not only do we see the contrast of light and dark, but we also have the contrast of human shapes and soft forms with hard ones. And Stieglitz was so excited about this photograph that he ran to his dark room because he absolutely had to bring it up to see what was there. And he made a mistake and kind of ran something over this part, which almost looked like a supernatural church. He liked it even more because he had messed it up. But here's the reason why this was such a challenge. When a photograph is big like this, we can relate to it because those people might be the same size that we are. In the same way, say this photograph is 3.5 feet across, it's a pretty good size. I mean, we can relate to it. The forms are relatable, but a photograph is tiny. The photograph is so small that it's hard for you, and are you even interested so much in studying it? Because this is the direct proportion of what the photograph would have looked like. But still, again, if you remember, Stieglitz is making this work during the Progressive era. So he is also wanting in many ways to relate the viewer to the hardships of life in New York in the wintertime. And he is also making the kind of compositions that use the cold and the weather conditions, and the fact that he's not making it sharp on purpose. I'll show you in a few moments something a little bit more sharp. He's not making it sharp on purpose because he wants to convey to you this feeling of chill as he stood in this location, by the way, for some 3 hours in this heavy duty winter storm. And why did he do it? Because the camera club that he was a member of, that had much older members in it, said to him, you can't make a good photograph in a winter storm. In the same way that that you will not get the kind of images that you want unless you have the ability to control the lighting. Well, what happens here is the very next day, he comes upon a streetcar driver who's washing down his horses, and the steam that is coming off their backs, their overheated backs, creates this other illusion of how cold everything else is, and kind of the grittiness of these tracks, and kind of the muck and the mud and everything mixed together. But mind you, another thing that is so clever about this is he stands in a place where he can capture the classical motifs that are in the background. This is a picture of modern life with ancient life. So again, this problem of where do you stand? How do you compose this work so that it has meaning? Because we have these two entities that make everything in this work greater than the sum of its parts. What did he do when he came and showed the camera club these wonderful pictures they made? They laughed him out of the room and said, oh, Stieglitz, grow up. And of course, this is a challenge to a man who is already a rebel and an anarchist. What does he do? He studies, say, the work of Pizarro, who has created these kind of illusions that, you experience this in a shimmery city that now has gas lighting that turns into a magical place at night, in the same way that this turns into a magical place at night. If you cannot make pictures where there is no light and the weather conditions are not perfect, then how is it that Stieglitz is able to do this? He is so determined to overturn everything that the camera club naysayers are saying is either not good photography, or photography that doesn't convey anything, or it has no quality in and of itself that makes it unique. Well, he decided he was going to break away from them. He was going to secede from the old way of doing things. So one of the ways that he attempted to do this was to create his own group of artists who were interested in not only experimentation, and he had enough money, as I said, fortunately, to publish this magazine, which couldn't stay in print for very long because it was so expensive to replicate the photographs. He began to invite women who he thought were superior in this field. This is Gertrude Kasebier, who you can see has manipulated her clothing here and also done a lot of brushwork on the portrait she made of him. She was in a miserable, miserable marriage. When he asked her, was she married? She showed him this picture. Yes, she is married. She's married to a man who is well-placed, arrogant, and she can't bear to be in his company. But she decides that if she can make a living for herself, if she can find her own way of supporting himself and doesn't have to answer to this man, she became a pictorial photographer. We can see that the only thing that makes photography come to life in the way that it does is understanding textures. Since photography is inherently flat, the textures have to do all the talking. She is, in the same way that Mary Cassatt, making the kind of paintings that would be appropriate for a woman because at this time a woman was never out without a chaperone. Consequently, Mary Cassatt's paintings seem to always be of interior scenes of sisters and mothers and people drinking tea that are all, you know, protected from the elements, and men out of doors. What happens with Kasebier is she is modeling her work on not only other photographic clubs like the Linked Ring, like the Photo Secession, like other people in France who are trying to elevate the status of this art form to something high. She is doing her level best to create some of the best photographs that were made at this time. And here again, she's using natural light. So you can imagine how many takes, how many times, how many hours you have to wait to be able to get this kind of image that the light comes across in such a way that you can see so many of these textures and the things that are required to shine, whether it's brass or glass, can be captured as well. We know that Tarbell was a man that could use color magnificently well, but he's doing this in these kind of sepia tones because Gertrude Kasebier is doing the kind of work that was rarely seen everywhere in the world. Now, what happens with her that makes her in many ways a household name is that the first installment of Camera Work magazine had at least 7 of her pictures in it. And not only did she make wonderful portraits and landscapes and these kinds of things, but Stieglitz, because he wanted to make it such an important journal, that he had the best writers and poets and essayists submit work to be published in the book as well. It was an all-encompassing work for the arts. In later years, the photo secession photographers are going to break away from Stieglitz because he's going to be featuring so much art and so much discussion on modern art in camera work that they are going to feel that he betrayed them. But he was doing it in this effort to help everyone understand that all of the art forms could live together harmoniously. So one of the ways that he did it, again, very, very clever, is Clarence White, who's going to be a dominant force in American photography and create the first photography school, by the way, in the United States, is a man that is part of this secession movement. And he too is, you can see, modeling his compositions around the French Impressionists. These are works that we would recognize as Renoir, Monet, so on. And Stieglitz was hanging them side by side in the gallery that he created to promote all this, called 291. So even here, when you see these kind of covers for upcoming events at 291, they're very abstracted. They're very kind of African form-ish, because there are going to be periods when Picasso, Paccabbia, Marcel Duchamp, they're going to show their work here as well, their artwork, and it's going to be reflected in the advertisements that go out, and sometimes even the covers for the journals that people will buy when they visit. So this is what will happen. He will continue to show the gallery spaces here, and what was formerly an office is going to be turned into this gallery space. And you came here either by appointment or you came here when you were invited to a show. Another very important thing that happened was that Stieglitz got himself together with Edward Steichen. Edward Steichen manipulated this work here, Auguste Rodin with the Thinker, and a plaster mock-up of George Bernard Shaw, is manipulating his work so much. This is a photograph that Stieglitz took of him, but this is Steichen. And these works are so manipulated that you don't know that it was made by a camera. But the big thing that was important about Steichen is he was a highly accomplished artist. If you have artists that do this kind of work, and they are as equally as interested in making photographs, and in particular, at a time when color photography becomes a possibility, and in between 1905 and 1907 or so, this a Russian photographer was making these kind of color photographs, Leo Tolstoy here, doing it with a 3-color process. He had a camera that had 3 different filtered colors in it, and it produced this kind of magnificent work. Well, as you know, everything in the world is political, including art. So there was no way that the West was going to let a backwater like Russia invent color photography and do it in this kind of way, in this magnificent kind of way. What happens then about 1904 or 5 is that many people are trying to create color photography and are trying to manipulate photographs, say in this case, Edward Steichen, who was influenced by the works made 3 decades before by James McNeill Whistler. So we can see what he's doing there. And he is now using kind of many layers of pigments that are individually coated, exposed, and washed off, and additions and subtractions. So you can see what's happening here. So in a decade and a half, this is the Flatiron Building, and this is the Flatiron Building by Stieglitz. All of this competition is going on, and at the same time, we have Kodak. And once Kodak comes out, and it's inexpensive relatively to purchase, pretty expensive to print, but inexpensive, and you push the button and there's nothing more to it. And then there are camera clubs that go up everywhere. Then the competition for photographers becomes so intense and so insane that they don't have a minute to rest. They are constantly trying to beat out the competition and to continuously elevate their art form. And then what do we have? The invention of autochrome by the Lumiere brothers in France, who produced this in 1907. When this is embedded, then in the chemicals are embedded in the film itself. I'm guessing that's how it's done. Actually, I don't know exactly. But once you have this process, which becomes a one process kind of scenario where you're not painting anything, you're not using I can't think, multi-filters, then the camera club becomes very enthusiastic, because there's nothing better than creating work that looks like real life works and looks. And in addition to that, say in the works of Steichen, autochrome couldn't be fixed as sharp initially. It sort of looked like watercolors, but that had its own charm. And then you have these additional events in which the process continues to improve. So that, say, in the case of Steichen, when he's making these works in these neutral tones, within just a few years, he's able to make this magnificent color picture of Rodin with Eve here from the Gates of Hell. And doing these kind of experiments that are taking place, that are creating such havoc for artists, because when you look at this photograph, you're not even sure if this is something that was completely hand painted by an artist in the same way that this was. And this surely must be a watercolor, but it's not. It's an autochrome. And the way that Heinrich Kuhn was doing this kind of work, in which it was so romantic and so dreamy and so beautiful, and this kind of expression of artists that were doing so many innovations it is no accident that the art world had to pull forward in such a way that you could not replicate this with a camera. It's no accident that this happens in 1907, because the Kodachrome, invented by Kodak in the 1930s, and all of these ways of creating these photographs is going to become more and more accurate, more beautiful, more sensitive, more amazing. Now, Alfred Stieglitz and Gertrude Stein, I think we all know, were important to each other because he was the American man that was a promoter of Picasso. She was the only French person that was a promoter of Picasso. And both of them understood, being that they had this rebellious nature in which they wanted to create a world according to their understanding. When Picasso starts to make these kinds of works that basically have many ways to be interpreted, but are one thing for sure, and that is a representation of shapes to other shapes. So what does Stieglitz do? He makes one of the most well-known, one of the most unusual, unique combination photos of his career that is going to, in many ways, make his future, and that is the steerage. So let's see what he says about this.
For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, Stieglitz rarely used his camera, promoting other photographers at the sacrifice of his own work. Now, a shipboard experience would stir him to create one of his most memorable images.
In June 1907, my wife, our daughter Kitty, and I sailed for Europe. My wife insisted on going on a large ship, fashionable at the time. It was impossible to escape the nouveau riche. Ye gods. By the third day out, I could stand it no longer. I had to get away. I walked as far forward as possible. Coming to the end of the deck, I stood alone, looking down. There were men, women, and children on the lower levels of the steerage. The scene fascinated me. A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right. White suspenders crossed on the back of a man below. A mast that cut into the sky, completing a triangle. I saw shapes related to one another, a picture of shapes, and underlying it, a new vision that held me. I raced to the main stairway of the steamer, chased down into my cabin, picked up my Graflex, raced back again, worrying whether or not the man with the straw hat had shifted his position. If he had, the picture I saw would no longer exist. The man with the straw hat had not stirred an inch. The man in the crossed suspenders, he too stood where he had been talking. No one had moved. I had only one plate holder with one unexposed plate. I released the shutter, my heart thumping. If I had captured what I wanted, it would be a picture based on related shapes and deepest human feeling. A step in my own evolution.
And so his excitement was palpable. When he published Camera Work magazine and he published some of the few little word portraits that Gertrude Stein had come up with, like a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, or he was just including in them quotes that she added to the kind of pictures that look like dreams or something that was taking place in an alternative world. He was initially publishing these kind of pictorials, these kind of illusions in Camera Work magazine, but before he knew it, people were submitting these kind of works that look like cubism. Say in the case of Coburn, who was a man that was well steeped in pictorialism, was changing his style altogether. The event that was one of the most crucial events in his life was meeting Georgia O'Keeffe. He's going to make her future. She's going to be the only woman who ever lived who became an international superstar in the art world in her own life. And she became his subject for numerous portraits of her. She eventually became his wife. They lived together at the Shelton Hotel. And all the while she was involved, this is the Shelton Hotel and the paintings that she made of it. This one not so inspired, this one certainly very clever. And he was making photographs outside of his studio 291, outside one of his windows, and on the 30th story of the Shelton Hotel, where both of them would step out, set up their easel, and start to make either paintings or photographs of what was going on around them. These are some of the photographs that he made where his family had a weekend home on Lake George. But he considered to be his greatest contribution toward the end of his life, the photographs that he made of clouds. It was the most creative and unusual undertaking of his career because he said he wanted to find himself in something that he couldn't control. He was advanced in age at this time, having been born in the 1860s. For him to have lived more than 80 years was a most unusual thing, since life expectancy was around 30 or 40 years. And he got very much involved with the abstract art movement and translated On the Spiritual and Art that was written by Kandinsky, in which he was attempting to tell the audience that was not enthusiastic about abstract art that shapes have their own value, and that you can relate to these kinds of things if you study what abstract art is about, and that it is representational and equivalent and is simultaneous with human feelings. In the same way that it takes time to understand what Clifford Still is doing, in the same time that it takes you to understand why is it that Jackson Pollock would have made drip paintings, then he was attempting to explain to people. Stieglitz was attempting to explain that everything fit together, that everything worked together, and that artists were representing their life and times in a way that was meaningful to that period. For 4 decades, he worked to convince the public that photography was art, and that being a gallery owner, being a publisher, an author, an educator, a patron of the arts was a worthwhile thing to do, because in that way you change people's mindset and you open up their minds to possibilities. Next time, we're going to talk about fashion photography and how fashion changes throughout the ages according to the political and cultural influences.